Welcome, students. This is our first presentation on Christopher Columbus, the discovery of America, where virtually all American history surveys begin. And the reason is because, in a real way, this is where history begins in America. Sure, there were people in America before Christopher Columbus, they had a past, but history is a record of the written past. And Native American groups did not have a written language when Columbus arrived. So, in a real sense, they had an oral record, they had oral history, but they didn't have a written history. And so it does make sense this is going to be the place where history begins in America, the coming together of the old world and the new. If you listen to the introductory um, music that I had cued for you. You heard a little song by Christopher Cross, probably not an artist that's very well known now. Christopher Cross was a Grammy Award winning Best New Artist in probably 1979, 1980, somewhere right around the turn of that decade. A big star for a while, still well known in some circles, but unfortunately for him, this was just before music television, and he was not exactly a video star. He's just a more pure musician. But I like to play songs from him as an introduction to Christopher Columbus, because of course you've got the name Christopher Cross, Columbus crossing an ocean. Plus the titles fit very well. I had Ride Like the Wind cued for you, but I could just as easily have played songs like Sailing or another that's called Never Be the Same. All of those are appropriate here because, of course, as after Christopher Columbus makes his voyages to America, the world is never going to be the same. It's going to set in motion enormous changes in world history. Well, in this presentation, there's a few things we're going to be focused on. One, we do need to understand, why is it that Columbus is considered the discoverer of America? Obviously, there were people here already. They were not lost. They didn't need to be discovered. So, what is it we mean by Christopher Columbus discovering America? Why is it that he gets so much credit? Another question we'll look at is whether or not Columbus should be treated as a hero or a villain in this whole story. What is the moral implication here? And then finally, we will be looking at some of the details of Columbus's four voyages to the United States. So I want you to know some background and some of the details of Columbus's voyages. These are the questions we'll focus on. And this is just a reminder that history, this is our introduction to a history course, history is all about questions. The word history in ancient Greek just meant inquiry. It means we're asking questions. What happened? Why did it happen? These are the things that history tries to answer. And that's what we'll do here today. Let's start off with background on Christopher Columbus. This is a picture of Columbus um, with the Spanish rendering of his name, Cristobal Colon. Um, but of course, he's not Spanish. He was Italian. He was from the city of Genoa in northwestern Italy. That's found just about right there on the Mediterranean coast. Um, and he was known as Colombo there. So, various renderings of his name. Christopher Columbus is an English rendering of that name, and that's why we tend to hear it the most in English language places. Well, Columbus was born around the mid 1400s, 1453, and 51 or 2. Columbus was um, from a poor family. His father was a wool weaver, but being right there on the coast, he certainly got to see a lot of um, merchants going out into the sea and trading. Um, Genoa was a port city, And Columbus naturally had his eye toward the ocean as well. I say ocean, meaning the Mediterranean Sea. That's as far out as anyone really ventured. They certainly knew of the Atlantic, but no one went way across the Atlantic. Um, and Italian city states were very involved in all trade that took place in the Mediterranean. So it was natural that Columbus envisioned a future where he could be a sailor. He could be a ship captain perhaps someday, and a map maker. And he aspired to all those things. Well, as a young man, he worked on ships. And one voyage, in fact, took him just to the opening into the Atlantic. He was on a merchant vessel that came out here and was chased by pirates, where they were run aground. Fearing for his life, he ran ashore and ended up here in Portugal. Now, the reason that's important is that Portugal was really at the forefront of ocean-going vessels at this time. Portugal was ahead of the rest of Europe in sailing technology. They were building the best and fastest ships. They were developing the methods for knowing where you are, lines of latitude and longitude, better than anyone else. It makes sense because here they are right on the edge of the Atlantic. Their country just faces that enormous ocean. So it's natural that they looked to the ocean for their future commerce. And as this map shows, you can see Portuguese sailors had gone further and further away from Europe to some islands off of Europe, skirting the coast of Africa, going further and further down that continent that Europeans knew so little about. Well, Columbus lived in Portugal for a while. He married, he had a son in Portugal, and that was a good place for an aspiring sailor to be. There was a lot of interest, not just from Columbus, but from all of Europe in finding some water route, finding a way to sail to the Far East. How does someone get to China, to Japan, India, or what we would now call Indonesia, the East Indies? Well, Europeans knew about these places from travels of Marco Polo many years before, centuries before. Marco Polo had traveled by foot, across the Middle East and across all of Asia, and had lived in China for 24 years. So Europeans were aware of these places and the exotic goods that they had. There was just no easy way to get there. Because, of course, traveling where Marco Polo did means going through the Middle East, where there had been frequent conflict between Christian Europe and Muslim Middle East um, for centuries in the past. So Europeans were interested in finding a way to get to the Far East without having to go through what we now call the Middle East, finding a water route to the east. Well, Columbus thought he had the perfect plan. His plan was to sail west, go west, and then actually circumnavigate the globe and come around to the east. Now, Columbus wasn't the only one that knew that that was possible. The world did not, or average people um, did not all think that the world was flat. Well, many uneducated people might have, but to the elite people who knew the ancient Greeks already knew that the world was round. So um, it's somewhat of a myth to think Columbus was the only one that knew the world was round. No, they knew it was round, but no one had dared to venture thousands of miles across an ocean to prove it. So Columbus had this idea getting to the Far East by sailing west. Well, while he's living in Portugal, that idea wasn't going to get anywhere. He could not convince the monarch of Portugal to support his idea because, as you'll notice from the map here, the Portuguese had made their way further and further down the coast of Africa. By the way, because the Portuguese are having such close contact with Africa, it makes sense that's going to be the country that starts the African slave trade. They're having the most contact with Africans. They're going to be the ones that start um, that unfortunate business in trading in human beings here with Africa. Well, notice the furthest line we have is the voyage of Bartholomew Diaz. This was happening while Columbus lived in Portugal. Diaz actually made it to the very tip of Africa. This Cape of Good Hope, it was now, it is called now. When Diaz's men went there, they called this a Cape of Storms. Very rough seas there. His men were sick and they were tired of this voyage. They insisted on turning back. But the reason it was a finding of good hope was that Diaz had proved there's an end to this enormous continent. Now, notice they'd been hugging the coast here a long time, but now, for the first time, Europeans could prove you can get around this landmass. At least theoretically, you should be able to head back north and east. You should run into Asia. So, Bartholomew Diaz made an important discovery while Columbus was in Portugal, and it meant the Portuguese aren't interested in sailing west in order to get east. Their route is already determined. Sail around Africa and get to Asia. And in fact, a few years later, that's what Vasco da Gama is going to do. Vasco da Gama will be the first sailor to go from Europe all the way to Asia by water route. He wins that contest. Well, Columbus has no luck convincing people in Portugal to support his plan, but he will go to other countries. He'll go to Spain. And there in Spain, he lives for many years and tries to convince the monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella to support his plan. He also sends a brother out, to have contact in France and in England. He's looking for any monarch who will support his plan, someone who will give him ships and who will support a plan for sailing west in order to get to the East Indies. Well, after many years in Spain, he finally does convince them to at least give him a chance. They're not really going to support a lot. He'll have 3 ships that they confiscate from sailors along the southern part of Spain. And Columbus will have his first voyage. But you need to understand, before he goes on this first voyage, Columbus had been quite the salesman to make this deal happen. Columbus had to convince Ferdinand and Isabella that he's a worthy cause to bet on. And he also said, if I do this, I want to be the governor of anything that I find. I will go and sail in the name of Spain, but I'm going to be the governor of whatever it is that we come to. He's looking for some political power here. And he said he wanted 10% of any riches that they might find. He's hoping this is going to be a very profitable trip, and he wants 10% of it. And finally, he wants a title. He wants to be known as Admiral of the Ocean Sea. That's kind of the most important admiral anywhere. If you're the admiral of the ocean, not just the Mediterranean, but the ocean sea. So Columbus drives a hard bargain, but Ferdinand and Isabella go ahead and take a risk and send him out on his first voyage. Now, I'm going to talk about the different voyages, more detail on the first one than the others, but I want you to pay attention to some of the details of each of these voyages. The first voyage, in the first voyage, 1492, Columbus heads out from southern Spain. They stop in the Canary Islands for just a little while, and that was an area that they already knew. The Spanish and the Portuguese had already settled there. So the Spanish It was basically just a straight shot from the Canary Islands. It looks pretty simple on the map here, and knowing that we know what's on a map, it doesn't look too terribly difficult. But again, for Columbus and his men, they have no idea how far they had traveled. They didn't know how far they may go before they run into land. Now, Columbus is good with navigational tools, so he knows how far he has traveled, and he constantly lied to the men about how far they had gone. He didn't want them to be that afraid. You know, if he had already gone 800 miles, he would only tell the men they had been maybe 400. That sounds less scary than thinking we're 800 miles from any land we know of. The men were getting very restless. And so Columbus continued on, continued on. Again, most educated people know that the world is flat, but there's still a lot of mystery about the ocean. If they come to a place where there's just seaweed, moss everywhere in everywhere they can see in this one big spot in the ocean, they may feel like we're going to get stuck. We're running aground. We're going to be stuck and can't move. We'll just, the tides will have stopped and we'll starve here. Well, they make it through these challenges. They can still get some encouragement seeing there are birds overhead. They have to land somewhere. Birds don't really want to fly thousands of miles between stops. So where is it that they're perching? Well, finally, the men had just about had enough and were ready to turn back. Columbus says, if we don't see land in 3 days, we'll turn around. But on that third day, they see land. They come to the Caribbean islands. And the first island that he comes to, he'll call San Salvador, because to him, it is Holy Savior. It was sort of a thank you, Jesus, we found land. We're not going to die. And the men were very grateful. Well, when Columbus and his men come to the islands, they find other people there. People they think are in the East Indies, so they call them Indians. There's various tribes there, but the first people they encounter were called the Taínos, and they were very curious about Columbus. They had never seen anyone that looked like him either. This pale-skinned person coming out of the ocean, and they revered him. They didn't know anything about metal tools. They cut their hands trying to hold a Spanish sword. Um, Columbus believed they had no religion whatsoever. Now, that wasn't actually true. They did have some belief system, but they didn't really talk about or know about the one true God. They didn't talk about Jesus' sacrifice. They believed in something having created nature, but they had very different stories of how the earth came to be. So Columbus thought these are a people who will be very easily converted to Christianity. By the way, Christianity, and this would be Catholic Christianity, was very important to Columbus. This is 1492. This is prior to a Protestant Reformation. So Catholicism is everywhere in Europe. Virtually all Europeans are considered Christians. They are under the Catholic Church. And there's connections between Catholic Church and the monarchs of all these European countries. Now, Columbus is not on this voyage strictly for religious purposes, but religion is part of who he is, and he certainly thinks about converting people that he's going to encounter. He says these Taínos will be very easily converted because they seem to have no religion whatsoever. Well, his name too is kind of a clue. The way he signs his name is a clue about his religious views. There was the way he starts writing his name, Christopher Columbus, the way he arranges it, he harkens back to a story of a Catholic saint, a Saint Christopher. The story of Saint Christopher was that he was a man, a humble man who would help travelers cross a dangerous river by putting them on his shoulders, helping them get across. So the story was that Saint Christopher one time picked up a child to carry across the river. And this child was extremely heavy. It felt like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. This was a big baby. But once he got the child across the river, then it was revealed to Saint Christopher this was no ordinary child. This was the Christ child. He was the Christ carrier or the Christ bearer. He carried Christ across this body of water. Well, you can see why Christopher Columbus would like that story and start to see himself also as someone who is carrying Christ, carrying Christianity across an ocean. There's a fairly recent book um, called Quest for Jerusalem, and its argument is that one of Columbus's main goals, of course, he wants the title, he wants the riches, he wants to be governor, but one of the argument of this book is that one of the things Columbus hopes to do with all of that wealth that he attains is to help start another crusade in the Middle East for Christians to recapture Jerusalem, area that had been constantly fought over between Christians and Muslims since the first crusade in the 11th century. Columbus wants to bring Christianity back to the Middle East. He wants to finance a crusade to Jerusalem. Well, an interesting book there, but Columbus's purpose was more commercial here and self-serving, but certainly he's still a religious man. They run into the Taínos, other tribes of Indians as well. Columbus does take some of these Taínos. He wants to show people back in Spain the kind of people he has met. Now, for us today, we would say, isn't that terrible how he could just kidnap someone and take them, force them onto his ship, take them back? They must have been terrified. Yes, they were. Columbus was not thinking so much about their feelings. He's thinking about how do I prove that I've been somewhere and I've found these exotic people. He doesn't intend them harm, but they do die on this journey. They're not going to make it back home. Well, Columbus visits several islands in this area. They do come to Cuba. They come to Hispaniola, or where now Haiti and the Dominican Republic are. That becomes his main headquarters. But around Christmas, 1492, his biggest ship, the Santa Maria, runs aground. It's stuck. And they have to dismantle the ship and try to build a fort to house the people they'll have to leave behind. There was not enough room on the Nina and the Pinta to get all of the sailors back home. So they decide, let's just build a fort, build some sort of dwelling here out of the timbers of this ship to house the people that will have to be left behind. So since this happened on Christmas Day, they call this new town, this new settlement, La Navidad. It's the Nativity. And he was grateful that they had these timbers to build a dwelling. So Columbus returns early the next year and has exciting stories to tell about his discoveries. Columbus, just knew he is right there in the Indies. He's got to be really close to a mainland, but he had not yet hit any mainland, North or South America. So Ferdinand and Isabella were more convinced maybe this voyage will be very profitable for them. So on the second voyage, you can see they take quite a few more years, and they're going to send a lot more ships this time. This is the biggest of all of his voyages. Columbus goes with 17 ships and close to 1,500 men and cattle and sheep and horses. And they take a lot of people already with them. And here's where things really start to go wrong. When he arrives back at La Navidad, he'll find that the people that he left behind before were all dead. There's he was curious how that happened. Did they just starve? Were they killed by other hostile native groups? There's various tribes there, so each can blame another one. The Tainos will say, this was the Caribs. The Caribs are a cannibalistic people, and they killed all of the people that Columbus had left behind. Others could just say, the people you left behind were obnoxious. They're constantly coming out and demanding food and demanding others serve them. So they made everyone mad and got killed. There are various rumors about what happened to them, but this definitely was a turning point in the relations between Europeans and the Indians. The Europeans already felt like we can treat them differently because they are not Christians, the same way they had treated people on the Canary Islands and the Madeira Islands. When they met people who were not already Christian, they felt like we can enslave them. We can abuse them because they are not of us. They are not members of this church, this Catholic church. Well, this was Columbus's great failing. He was not a good governor of the lands that he found. He was more interested in sailing. He was an excellent sailor, and he was an excellent navigator. But he didn't pay much attention to how things are going to be governed. And so in this second voyage, there will be a lot of slaughter of Native Americans while Columbus is still searching. He's finding other islands. He's still looking for mainland. He's more interested in the sailing. But meanwhile, the governing is falling apart. And keep in mind, he's an Italian. He's from Genoa. He's an outsider among Spaniards, and many of them don't really want to listen to him. Whether he's admiral of the ocean sea or not, whether he's governor or not, they don't really look at him as a legitimate Spanish boss. So, lots of hardship on the second voyage for the Native Americans, and real atrocities begin. There were certainly some hardships of the Tainos that Columbus put on the ship to try to take back on the first voyage, but here's where a real slaughter begins. Columbus comes back after several years, and then there's a third voyage. You see, they do skirt more mainland of South America now, but Hispaniola was still headquarters. And this one may have been the worst experience for Columbus overall, because it was on this third voyage he actually gets replaced. Things had gone so badly governing wise on the second. Columbus had been stripped of his title. And now on this third voyage, Ferdinand and Isabella will actually send someone to replace him as governor, a Spaniard named Bobadilla. He becomes the governor, and he has Columbus arrested. Columbus is very offended by this. In fact, he wants to go back to Ferdinand and Isabella and show them, look at what this Bobadilla did to me. He's put me in chains. Columbus wanted to dramatize this because he thought, hey, I'm the reason any of us are ever there. This was my idea, and now he's lost his title. He's not getting 10% of all wealth. He's not governor. So the third voyage was really bad for Columbus. And he's getting more and more frustrated. He just knows he's right there next to China, India, somewhere in Asia. And yet he has not really found this massive number of people and massive amounts of wealth that he anticipated. So in the early 1500s, he will take one more voyage. This one also has some really scary moments for him. He's not even allowed to land at first, but he's such a good sailor that he could ride out the hurricane easier than any other ships could. So he he makes it safely there, where a lot of other Spanish vessels starting to leave and return, they end up capsizing and drowning. But in some of Columbus's exploration on this fourth trip, he actually gets stranded in Jamaica for a while. Now, if we think we're near a resort and we're just having feet in the sand, people might think that would be a really nice place to be stranded. But you're thinking there's some ice, and there's nice things to do, and there's jet skis or snorkeling or things like that. No, no, no. It would be terrifying to just be stranded on an island, hot island, and not sure if you're ever going to make it back home at all. Columbus and a few of his men, they actually construct rafts and can row far enough that they can get help, and so Columbus will survive this. But again, when he returns, he's more and more frustrated because he just knows he's on the verge of some great discovery, and it never really realizes where he is. He doesn't realize he's hit something far separate from Asia, far separate from the Indies, that's going to be very important in the future of world history. He doesn't realize. So he dies just a couple of years after this fourth voyage. He dies still very frustrated. Now, he's not broke. He still has a lot of money, but he didn't get 10% of all the wealth. And other people are starting to be recognized as great sailors too. That's a source of frustration for him. In fact, North and South America, where do we get those names? That's from a different Italian sailor named Amerigo Vespucci. He travels in South America in the early 1500s, and when a German map maker finds out about his voyages, he assumes Amerigo must have been the one that found these places. So on that map, North and South America are used, and Columbus's name is not really part of the continents. So Columbus dies very frustrated. Now, let's get back to the question I posed from the beginning. Why is Columbus considered the discoverer of a new world? Obviously, there were people already here. There were even other explorers, way back. A Viking named Leif Erikson had landed somewhere in the icy northern parts of North America almost 500 years earlier, about the year 1000. Why does Columbus get so much credit? Well, here's the short answer. It's all about timing. Columbus comes along at just the right time, where what happens to him, what he does, is going to be remembered. It's going to make a difference for many, many years to come. And here's what I mean. Let me elaborate on this timing issue just a little bit. 1492 was already a big year for Spain, even before Columbus makes this first voyage. Spain had been unified a couple of decades before 1492. It had been unified through the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. They were actually royal in two different kingdoms, Castile and Aragon. And so when they marry, it has united those two big Spanish kingdoms. They had already been united, but they were now trying to conquer the last place that a Muslim group had controlled in Spain. The Muslims had come into Spain and really had taken charge since the early 700s. This was the place in Europe where Islam spread the most. They had spread from the Middle East across northern Africa and into Spain. So Ferdinand and Isabella, these Christian monarchs, they really wanted to drive the Muslims out. It's a crusade right there at home, and consolidate their rule in Spain. And that's really what happens in 1492. They finally had conquered the Muslims. And Spain was a very, very proud Catholic Christian country, united. Well, Columbus was there for that final fight in 1492. That's part of what he's having to wait on. Um, and, when that is successful, then he can make his voyage. So this was already a big year in Spanish history, European history, that we need to know about. So that's part of the timing, but more specifically about Columbus. Columbus's voyages are not going to be forgotten. It's not going to be something that happens and no one ever talks about or no one ever hears about, because in the mid 1400s, there's the invention of a printing press. Imagine this is like the internet or the Middle Ages. I know it's not as fast as the internet, but for them, this was a communications revolution, that you can print the same thing over and over and over again. Once you set out the little letters for the typeface, you can have that pressed on and reproduced many, many times over. And so word of Columbus's voyage is going to spread. Obviously, people don't hear about it fast enough to know he's the discoverer, not Amerigo Vespucci. But still, what Columbus has done is going to spark more voyages. Other people are going to be following in his wake, because the printing press is going to make sure that this is not a one-time thing that's forgotten. It's not a Leif Erikson kind of thing. Another issue of timing here is that in the late Middle Ages, we're getting a greater sense of nationalism in various kingdoms. Now, a kingdom is really just kind of you're connected to a certain royal family and you owe homage to them. But over the Middle Ages, especially by the time we get to the 1400s, there's starting to emerge some stronger monarchs that inspire a lot more national identity, and real pride in your national identity. Ferdinand and Isabella are these kinds of monarchs in Spain, but there's also the Tudor dynasty in England, with Henry VII and Henry VIII there. France will be getting a strong sense of nationalism, and the Netherlands. Columbus comes along just at a time where nationalism is growing. Why is that important? Well, it's important because these various nations are also going to be sending their explorers. Sometimes they'll borrow someone from Italy, but there'll be other explorers going out claiming things in the name of some nation. So Columbus comes along at a time there's going to be great competition between nations, and others are going to be following up with trips like Columbus. Let's add to that, just a few years later, 11 years after Columbus dies, we have this Protestant Reformation. Now, the reason that's important here under timing is that now not only do we have competition between nations, but there'll be competition between types of Christians. Some will be sailing in the name of the Catholic Church, like Spain or Portugal or France. Some will be sailing in the name of Protestant Christianity, like England or the Netherlands. So there's great competition between nations and between different types of Christian groups. And Columbus has set off an age of discovery. That is why he's really significant here. That's why he's considered the discoverer of a new world, someone who kickstarts this whole new era. Now, obviously, this is a major change. Columbus has an enormous impact on world history with this discovery. And you can't say that about Leif Erikson. You can't say that about any previous explorer. There was a book a few years ago called 1421, and that history book has a thesis. It argues that there may have been some sort of contact from China into the New World, crossing the Pacific and discovering the New World. Well, I'm not sure how convinced I am of that, but I think it's safe to say not much came from that. If there was any kind of contact with the New World from the Old World in 1421, it didn't seem to have an enormous, long lasting impact. We can't say that about Columbus. Columbus's discovery has enormous impact and has all of Europe really looking across the Atlantic now, and the Mediterranean becomes less and less significant to them. Now, let me finish up with one final piece here, the question about whether or not Columbus is a hero or a villain. Well, let's look at the Orthodox view. The Orthodox view, or an original view, would say Columbus is a hero. Columbus was a very brave man and he does wonderful things. This would be what American writer Washington Irving would be saying in the early 1800s. You might know Washington Irving from The Legend of Sleepy Hollow or Rip Van Winkle. Well, he also wrote about Columbus. And Irving was not a historian. He's a literary figure. And so he's really more interested in telling a good story. It makes for a good story to say Columbus is the only one that knew the world was round. And it makes for more entertaining story to just present him as a hero. Well, certainly he was brave, physically brave, and he was intelligent. He was a good sailor. Those are the things that the original view of Columbus would emphasize. And in fact, in 1893, this was just a little off of a 400-year anniversary of Columbus. There's a big World's Fair in Chicago, and they're really celebrating Columbus there. Italian Americans have reason to be proud of him because they're Italian. And, the Spanish can be very proud that this is, that they helped kickstart this whole age of discovery. And so there's lots of celebration of how important Columbus has been to all of world history. But that was a very European-centered view. Okay, the other side, the critical view, says, well, we might think of it from the Native American perspective. Columbus is more of a villain. Columbus helps bring destruction to Native Americans, whether he personally does it or it's just his poor management. Columbus is the symbol of someone who brings about a real negative change in Native American cultures, a devastation to them. Native Americans may say 1491 was the last good year. 1492 is not something to celebrate. And in fact, there were some that were contemporaries of Columbus that had a more critical view. Bartolome de las Casas, now he's not critical of Columbus personally. Bartolome de las Casas was a priest who was some of the early settlers in the Caribbean. He had witnessed much of this destruction of Native Americans, and actually it really struck his conscience. It started to bother him so badly. Now, he doesn't say it was all blamed on Columbus. He thought Columbus was a good Christian Italian man, but Bartolome de las Casas was very critical of some of his fellow Spaniards and their treatment of Native Americans. He thought they had been ruthless, and he writes about the destruction of the East Indies, talking about, the West Indies, where they actually were. He writes about this destruction of the Indies and talking about the torture that some of the Spaniards would put the natives through. He's very troubled by this. And, understand, Bartolome de las Casas was a man of his time. He did not believe that Native Americans' culture was equal to his own. He did not think that they can just continue to worship and believe however they want, and theirs is also a path to heaven. No, no, no. He's a medieval man of the 15th and early 16th century. He believed Christianity was the only way to heaven. And he believed that these natives needed to convert or they would be eternally condemned. But he didn't think that forcibly converting them was a good thing. And so he's quite critical of the conquest of these native people. And symbolically, Columbus is at the head of that. So, I can still remember 1992. I was probably more your age about that time. 1992, the 500-year anniversary of Columbus. Not really a huge celebration. I mean, there were certainly some celebrations around the country, but the nation had changed such that by 1992, there's more negative things said about Columbus than positive. There's more emphasis on what happened to the Native Americans as a result of Columbus's discoveries. So I'm sorry to disappoint. I'm not going to give you a definitive answer here because a lot of these value judgment questions are really not good history questions. They're moral judgment questions. Is Columbus a hero or a villain? Well, things in history are usually not quite so black and white, all this way or all that way. History is about complicated human beings who have positive qualities and have negative qualities. Now, unfortunately, this is the kind of history question that most of us tend to want to gravitate toward. Real simplistic kinds of things, hero or villain. But that's not really what history is supposed to be about. History is supposed to be about understanding the past, not just judging those who've lived in the past, not saying, well, if I had been there, I would have acted differently. History is about trying to understand people of the past, other people made in God's image, and it may inform us in the present. I'm glad we have better understanding between people of very different cultures now. Part of the reason we have that is because of Columbus and others who may have been involved in some really nasty encounters between people. But now you and I don't have these kind of complete new world kinds of experiences, unless we actually go out into outer space and find some life there. So I can't give you a real definitive answer to this question. What I want to close with, though, is you understanding that history is an interpretation of the past that's always changing. When in 1893, most of America would have celebrated Columbus. 1992, they're not so sure. There's a much more critical view. Now, what Columbus did, what happened in the past, hadn't changed. What changed was the interpretation, how we look at it, and what it means to us. That is history. History is not just the same as the past. The past doesn't really change, but history is interpreting that past. And that is ever changing. That is very interesting, and what keeps history fresh is that we constantly have new looks and new interpretations of why things happened or what we should think about it. So can't give you a definitive answer, but it is a question worth mulling over in our heads. What were heroic aspects of Columbus? What were villainous aspects of Columbus? Well, we'll bring this to a close here. Hope you enjoyed this, and we'll get ready for another video very soon. So I'm going to just end this and see you next time.